Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to take you inside one of the most dangerous and notorious prisons in the world, La Sabaneta Prison in Venezuela. This facility was not just a place of incarceration. It was a living nightmare. Corruption, overcrowding, extreme violence, and lawlessness made it one of the deadliest prisons in history. One of the most shocking aspects of La Sabaneta Prison was its extreme overcrowding. Originally designed to house around 700 inmates, the facility ended up holding more than 3,700 prisoners at its peak. This meant that the prison was operating at over 5 times its intended capacity, creating a nightmarish environment where survival was a daily struggle. Prisoners were crammed into tiny cells, often sleeping on the floor or even standing due to lack of space. Inmates were forced to share whatever little resources were available, leading to constant fights and tensions. The lack of proper infrastructure meant that there were not enough beds, toilets, or even clean drinking water. The overcrowding also resulted in unbearable heat and humidity, making the conditions inside even more miserable. With thousands of prisoners packed into a space meant for a fraction of that number, disease spread rapidly. Inmates suffered from tuberculosis, skin infections, and other illnesses, but medical attention was scarce. The overcrowding made it nearly impossible for guards to maintain order, and as a result, the prison was largely controlled by gangs and violent criminals. The extreme congestion also made it difficult to provide proper food and sanitation. Many inmates went hungry because there was simply not enough food to go around. In such a chaotic environment, the weak were often preyed upon by the stronger prisoners, leading to a system of survival where only those with power or connections could secure basic necessities. The overcrowding in La Sabaneta was not just a failure of prison management. It was a humanitarian disaster. It exposed the deep flaws in Venezuela's criminal justice system, where prisoners were often forgotten and left to suffer in inhumane conditions. Even after the prison was shut down in 2013, its horrifying legacy remains a stark reminder of what happens when a prison system collapses under its own weight. La Sabaneta Prison was notorious not only for its overcrowding, but also for the complete absence of law and order within its walls. Unlike a traditional prison where guards enforce rules and maintain discipline, La Sabaneta was essentially a self-governed war zone, where prisoners were left to create their own brutal system of control. Instead of authorities maintaining order, violent gangs ruled the prison, deciding who lived, who suffered, and who died. The guards were either too afraid to intervene or were deeply involved in corruption. Many took bribes from powerful inmates, allowing them to smuggle in weapons, drugs, and other contraband. As a result, prisoners were often better armed than the guards themselves, making law enforcement inside the prison nearly impossible. The Venezuelan government had neither the resources nor the willingness to properly manage the facility, allowing the most dangerous criminals to take over. In this lawless environment, power was concentrated in the hands of Pernados, the gang leaders who controlled different sections of the prison. These powerful inmates ran their own mini-governments, collecting money from weaker prisoners in exchange for protection, a practice that was nothing short of extortion. If an inmate couldn't pay, they would be left vulnerable to beatings, starvation, or even execution. The complete breakdown of authority also meant that violence was constant. Fights between rival gangs erupted daily, and the weak were often brutally assaulted, raped, or murdered. The guards, rather than stopping the chaos, would often stay out of the way, knowing that intervention could cost them their lives. The lack of surveillance and security also made it easy for prisoners to manufacture homemade weapons, ranging from knives to makeshift guns, further escalating the bloodshed. Without any form of real governance, La Sabaneta Prison became a place where only the strongest survived. Justice was not served by the legal system, but by the violent hands of prisoners who decided the fate of others. There was no rehabilitation, no law, and no hope. Only fear and survival. One of the biggest reasons La Sabaneta Prison became a living hell was the widespread bribery and corruption that ran through every level of the system. In theory, a prison is meant to maintain order and rehabilitate criminals, but in La Sabaneta, money determined everything. From securing basic survival needs to gaining privileges, and even escaping punishment for crimes committed inside, bribery was the only way to have any kind of control over one's fate. The guards, instead of enforcing rules, were often deeply involved in corrupt activities. Since they were underpaid and poorly trained, many of them turned to bribery as a way to supplement their income. Inmates with money could buy access to better food, medical treatment, weapons, drugs, and even special privileges, while those without money were left to suffer. In some cases, prisoners had to pay just to avoid being placed in the most violent areas of the prison, where they would almost certainly become victims of abuse or murder. Corruption didn't just stop with the guards. The entire prison administration was involved, from the wardens to the staff who controlled supplies. Powerful inmates, often gang leaders known as Pernados, worked hand-in-hand with corrupt officials to maintain their rule. They collected money from weaker prisoners in exchange for protection, forcing them to pay just to stay alive. If an inmate couldn't pay, they were left vulnerable to brutal beatings, starvation, or even execution. Bribes were also the only way for prisoners to get medical attention. The prison was severely lacking in health care, and sick inmates often had to pay guards or nurses just to be seen by a doctor. Even then, medicine and proper treatment were rare, and many inmates simply died from preventable diseases because they couldn't afford to buy care. Weapons and drugs flowed freely through La Sabaneta, not because of prison breaks or smuggling from visitors, but because guards themselves sold them to inmates. A prisoner with money could easily buy a knife, a gun, or drugs like cocaine and heroin, further fueling the violent and lawless environment. Even the judicial system outside the prison was not free from corruption. Wealthy or connected inmates could bribe their way to lighter sentences, early releases, or even special privileges within the prison. This meant that many dangerous criminals continued to operate their gangs from inside, while poor inmates, even those imprisoned for minor crimes, had no way to improve their situation. The level of corruption in La Sabaneta was so severe that, instead of functioning as a correctional facility, it became a black market economy where survival depended on how much money or influence an inmate had. Those who controlled the flow of bribes had absolute power, while those who had nothing were left to rot in inhumane conditions. Violence was not just common in La Sabaneta prison, it was a way of life. The prison operated under a constant state of warfare, where murders, beatings, and torture were part of daily existence. Unlike in well-regulated prisons where guards control order, in La Sabaneta, the inmates ruled through sheer brutality. The weak were at the mercy of the strong, and survival often depended on a prisoner's ability to either fight or pay for protection. The lack of control from prison authorities meant that gangs ran the facility like a battlefield. The most powerful inmates, known as Pernados, acted as warlords, dividing the prison into different territories. Each gang controlled a specific section, and crossing into the wrong area often meant instant death. These gangs didn't just fight for power. They carried out violent executions, torture, and revenge killings to maintain their dominance. New inmates, especially those without money or connections, were often subjected to extreme violence from the moment they arrived. Some were beaten as a form of initiation, while others were killed simply because they had no one to protect them. Rape, extortion, and forced labor were also common, as stronger prisoners exploited the weak for their own gain. Weapons were everywhere in La Sabaneta, despite it being a maximum security prison. Handmade knives, machetes, and even firearms were smuggled inside, often with the help of corrupt guards who sold them for profit. These weapons made every dispute a potential bloodbath, with fights frequently escalating into full-scale riots. In some cases, inmates even set fire to entire sections of the prison, killing dozens in the process. One of the most horrifying aspects of the violence was the torture tactics used by gang leaders. Prisoners who disobeyed their commands were often tied up, beaten, burned, or dismembered in front of others to serve as a warning. Some were locked in tiny, windowless rooms for days without food or water, while others were thrown into sections of the prison controlled by rival gangs. ensuring their brutal deaths. With no medical care available, injured prisoners were often left to die. Even those who managed to survive attacks had to deal with severe infections, untreated wounds, and permanent disabilities. There were no investigations into murders, and no one was ever held accountable for the daily killings that took place. The sheer level of violence inside La Sabaneta made it one of the deadliest prisons in the world. Some reports estimated that dozens of inmates were murdered every month, and in times of major riots, the death toll could rise into the hundreds. The most disturbing part? These killings were not seen as extraordinary events. They were simply a normal part of life in La Sabaneta. One of the darkest and most horrifying events in La Sabaneta prison's history was the 1994 massacre, a brutal riot that resulted in the deaths of over 100 inmates. This massacre was not just a random outbreak of violence. It was a product of years of neglect, corruption, and lawlessness that had turned a prison into a ticking time bomb. When the violence finally exploded, it left a trail of death and destruction unlike anything seen before. The root of the massacre lay in the constant gang wars that dominated the prison. By 1994, La Sabaneta had become completely overrun by different criminal factions, each fighting for control over territory, resources, and power. The prison administration had long since lost control, leaving prisoners to enforce their own rules through sheer violence. The tension had been building for months, with smaller conflicts, murders, and attacks occurring daily. But in late 1994, a power struggle between rival gangs escalated into all-out war, igniting one of the deadliest riots in Venezuela's history. The riot started when one gang launched a surprise attack on a rival faction, using makeshift weapons such as knives, clubs, and even firearms smuggled into the prison. What followed was an hours-long bloodbath as prisoners hacked, stabbed, and shot each other in an attempt to wipe out their enemies. The fighting spread quickly, and soon, the entire prison was engulfed in chaos. Bodies piled up in the hallways, cells were set on fire, and prisoners were brutally executed in cold blood. The prison guards, vastly outnumbered and unwilling to risk their lives, did little to intervene. Many of them abandoned their posts, leaving inmates to slaughter each other without any attempt to restore order. Some reports suggest that even the guards supplied weapons to certain gangs, allowing them to kill off their rivals in exchange for bribes or favors. What made the massacre even more horrifying was the barbaric way in which many prisoners were killed. Some were burned alive inside their cells, while others were tortured before being executed. The sheer brutality of the killings shocked even the most hardened criminals, as prisoners were dismembered, decapitated, or set on fire in a display of unimaginable violence. Survivors later described the scene as a slaughterhouse, with blood covering the floors and bodies stacked like garbage. When government forces finally entered the prison to put an end to the riot, it was already too late. More than 100 inmates lay dead, with many others critically injured. The massacre exposed the true horrors of La Sabaneta to the outside world, drawing international condemnation. It revealed just how broken Venezuela's prison system was, and how neglect and corruption had turned its facilities into death camps rather than places of rehabilitation. Even after the massacre, little was done to reform La Sabaneta. The prison continued to operate under the same violent conditions for nearly 2 more decades, with frequent riots, killings, and corruption still running rampant. The 1994 massacre became a symbol of everything wrong with Venezuela's criminal justice system, yet it remained just one chapter in the long and bloody history of La Sabaneta Prison. The living conditions in La Sabaneta Prison were so inhumane and degrading that the facility was often described as a place where inmates were left to rot rather than rehabilitate. Designed for only 700 prisoners, yet overcrowded with more than 3,700 inmates at its peak, the prison quickly became a nightmare of filth, disease, and despair. Those who entered La Sabaneta knew they would be subjected to extreme suffering, brutal treatment, and an almost non-existent quality of life. One of the most horrific aspects of life in La Sabaneta was the lack of basic necessities such as clean water, food, and sanitation. The prison administration was either unwilling or unable to provide these essentials, leaving prisoners to fight over whatever limited resources were available. Food rations were minimal, often consisting of nothing more than a small portion of rice, beans, or stale bread. Many prisoners reported going days without eating, forcing them to rely on smuggled food or bribes to corrupt guards just to survive. Those who couldn't afford to pay often suffered from malnutrition, leading to severe weight loss, weakness, and even death. Water was also a scarce and highly valuable resource inside the prison. Clean drinking water was not regularly provided, and inmates were often forced to drink from contaminated sources, leading to widespread disease outbreaks. Showers and toilets were practically non-functional, with human waste accumulating in hallways and cells, making the already horrific conditions even worse. The stench of urine, feces, and decay filled the air, creating a breeding ground for infections, parasites, and deadly illnesses. The prison lacked proper medical care, leaving sick and injured inmates with no access to doctors, medicine, or even basic first aid. Diseases such as tuberculosis, skin infections, and respiratory illnesses spread rapidly due to the overcrowding and filthy environment. Prisoners with severe wounds from stabbings, beatings, or gunshots were often left untreated, leading to slow and agonizing deaths. Those suffering from chronic conditions, such as diabetes or heart disease, had no hope of receiving the medication they needed, further shortening their already brutal existence inside La Sabaneta. The physical conditions of the prison cells were beyond inhumane. Many prisoners were crammed into tiny, dark, and poorly ventilated rooms, often with no beds or mattresses. Some were forced to sleep on concrete floors, while others had to find space wherever they could, sometimes even standing for hours due to overcrowding. Temperatures inside the prison were unbearable, with extreme heat and humidity making it difficult to breathe, especially in the overcrowded cells. With no proper waste disposal system, garbage piled up inside the prison, attracting rats, cockroaches, and other vermin. Prisoners were constantly bitten by insects, suffered from skin rashes, and developed respiratory problems due to the toxic conditions. The smell of death and decay was ever present, with corpses sometimes left to rot for days before being removed. Adding to the suffering, La Sabaneta offered no programs for rehabilitation, education, or personal growth. Unlike other prisons that might provide work programs, religious services, or education, La Sabaneta was purely a place of punishment and torment. There were no attempts to reform prisoners or prepare them for reintegration into society. Instead, inmates were left to fend for themselves in a lawless and violent environment, where survival often depended on joining a gang or submitting to the rule of criminal overlords. The horrific living conditions in La Sabaneta stripped prisoners of their humanity, turning them into desperate individuals willing to do anything just to stay alive. The prison was not just a place of confinement. It was a slow and torturous death sentence for those trapped inside. La Sabaneta prison was not just a place of violence and brutality. It was also a breeding ground for deadly diseases. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, lack of medical care, and malnutrition combined to create one of the most unsanitary and unhealthy environments imaginable. For many inmates, disease was as much of a threat as gang violence, and death from illness was common. Once a disease spread inside La Sabaneta, there was little hope of stopping it, and even less hope of receiving proper treatment. One of the most widespread and deadly diseases in La Sabaneta was tuberculosis, TB. With thousands of prisoners crammed into tight, unventilated spaces, TB spread rapidly through the air, infecting anyone who came into close contact with an infected inmate. Those suffering from TB developed severe coughs, fever, weight loss, and extreme weakness, but no medical treatment was provided. In many cases, infected inmates were left to die slow, agonizing deaths, coughing up blood in their overcrowded cells, while others desperately tried to avoid catching the disease. Skin infections were another major issue. Because of the lack of clean water, soap, and medical supplies, many prisoners developed horrific skin conditions, including fungal infections, scabies, boils, and open sores. These conditions often became severely infected due to the filthy environment, leading to painful abscesses and, in extreme cases, gangrene. Since there were no antibiotics available, a minor skin infection could turn into a fatal condition, causing prisoners to suffer excruciating pain before succumbing to septic shock. Gastrointestinal diseases were also rampant due to the contaminated water supply and lack of proper food storage. Dysentery, cholera, and food poisoning were constant threats, as prisoners were often forced to drink dirty water and eat spoiled food. Those who fell ill suffered from severe diarrhea, dehydration, and malnutrition, yet medical care was nearly impossible to obtain. Some prisoners died simply because they had no access to clean drinking water, making La Sabaneta more like a medieval dungeon than a modern prison. Malaria and dengue fever were additional deadly threats, especially for inmates housed in areas exposed to mosquitoes. The prison's poor infrastructure meant that standing water and filthy conditions provided the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes, leading to frequent outbreaks of these deadly diseases. Prisoners infected with malaria suffered from high fevers, chills, muscle pain, and extreme weakness, yet there were no mosquito nets, no preventive measures, and no proper medical treatments. Many simply wasted away in their cells, unable to fight off the disease. Mental health was also a major health crisis in La Sabaneta. The extreme violence, constant fear, and horrific living conditions left many inmates suffering from severe anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. However, there were no mental health services available, and prisoners experiencing psychological distress were often left to deteriorate without any support. In extreme cases, mentally ill prisoners were beaten, abused, or even killed by fellow inmates who saw them as weak or a burden. Suicide was a tragically common occurrence, as many inmates saw death as the only escape from their suffering. For many prisoners, disease was a slow, torturous death sentence. With no way to get help and no way to escape the unsanitary conditions, thousands suffered agonizing deaths from preventable and treatable illnesses. The prison system did nothing to stop these outbreaks, making La Sabaneta one of the most medically neglected and dangerous prisons in the world. One of the most horrific realities of life in La Sabaneta Prison was the complete lack of medical care. Inmates suffering from injuries, diseases, or chronic illnesses were left to fend for themselves in an environment where survival was already a daily struggle. The Venezuelan government provided little to no healthcare support, and the few medical facilities that existed inside the prison were severely understaffed, underfunded, and often inaccessible to most prisoners. For thousands of inmates, even the most basic medical treatment was a luxury they could not afford. Prisoners who got sick were often ignored by guards and prison authorities, no matter how severe their condition. Many were left to die slow, painful deaths in their cells, with no doctors, no nurses, and no medicine available to ease their suffering. Even in cases of severe injuries from stabbings, beatings, or gunshot wounds, there was little hope of receiving any professional medical attention. Wounded inmates were often left to bleed out on the dirty floors, surrounded by filth and decay. If a prisoner wanted medical treatment, the only way to get it was through bribery. Those with money could pay corrupt guards or staff members for access to medicine or a doctor, while those without financial resources were simply left to suffer. The black market inside La Sabaneta thrived on this desperation, with prisoners forced to buy basic medical supplies like painkillers, antibiotics, or bandages at exorbitant prices. Even then, the drugs were often expired, stolen, or completely ineffective. The lack of medical care also meant that contagious diseases spread unchecked. Inmates suffering from tuberculosis, cholera, malaria, or severe infections were not isolated or treated, allowing diseases to spread rapidly through the overcrowded prison. Those with open wounds often developed horrific infections, leading to gangrene, sepsis, and eventually death. A simple cut or untreated fever could become a death sentence, and with no doctors available, Many prisoners had no choice but to suffer in agony until their bodies could no longer fight off the infection. Even prisoners with chronic illnesses such as diabetes, asthma, or high blood pressure were completely abandoned. There were no regular checkups, no access to prescription medications, and no medical monitoring. Diabetic prisoners often fell into comas due to lack of insulin, while those with asthma suffocated without inhalers or proper treatment. Prisoners with heart conditions often died suddenly, as there was no way to manage their conditions in such a brutal and unsanitary environment. Mental health care was non-existent, despite the fact that many prisoners suffered from extreme trauma, PTSD, and severe psychological distress. The constant violence, overcrowding, and inhumane conditions took a severe toll on inmates' mental health, leading to high rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. Yet, there were no psychiatrists, no counseling services, and no medication for mental illness. Instead of receiving help, mentally ill prisoners were often abused, neglected, or even killed by other inmates who saw them as weak. In the rare cases where a prisoner was granted outside medical attention, the process was painfully slow and filled with bureaucratic corruption. Inmates who needed urgent surgery or hospitalization were often denied transport unless their families could pay bribes to prison officials. Even when a prisoner was allowed to leave for medical care, there was no guarantee they would receive proper treatment. Many died waiting for approval, their conditions worsening due to months or even years of neglect. With no real medical system in place, La Sabaneta became a death trap for anyone who fell ill or suffered an injury. The prison's total disregard for human life was evident in the way sick and wounded inmates were left to suffer without any hope of relief. The lack of medical care was not just negligence. It was a form of slow, torturous execution that claimed the lives of thousands of prisoners over the years. Corruption was not just a problem in La Sabaneta Prison. It was the foundation upon which the entire system operated. From the lowest-ranking guards to high-level prison officials, nearly everyone in charge was involved in bribery, smuggling, and power deals with inmates. In fact, instead of controlling the prison, the authorities had completely handed over power to gangs, allowing them to run the facility like a lawless kingdom where violence, extortion, and drug trafficking were the only laws that mattered. At the top of this criminal hierarchy were the prans, powerful inmate leaders who ruled over the prison population with absolute authority. The prans controlled every aspect of life inside La Sabaneta, from who lived and who died to who received food, water, and a place to sleep. Their power was built on fear and violence, and any prisoner who refused to obey their orders faced torture, beatings, or execution. Even guards and prison staff feared them, knowing that crossing a pran could lead to deadly consequences. One of the main reasons gang leaders were able to maintain such dominance was because of widespread corruption among the prison staff. Many guards were severely underpaid, making them easy targets for bribes and threats. Instead of maintaining order, they worked hand in hand with the prans, helping them smuggle in weapons, drugs, and even prostitutes in exchange for money. In some cases, guards actively participated in criminal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and contract killings ordered by the gangs. For prisoners who had money or connections, corruption offered a way to buy privileges that were otherwise impossible to obtain. Those who could afford to bribe the right people could get better living conditions, access to weapons, protection from gangs, or even early release through forged documents. Meanwhile, inmates who had nothing were left at the mercy of the prans, forced to obey their rules or suffer the consequences. The most terrifying part of gang control was the level of brutality used to maintain order. La Sabaneta had its own twisted system of justice, where the prans acted as judge, jury, and executioner. If a prisoner was accused of breaking the rules, whether it was stealing, disrespecting a gang leader, or even looking at someone the wrong way, they could be sentenced to gruesome punishments. These included torture, forced labor, starvation, or being thrown into the most dangerous sections of the prison, where death was almost guaranteed. One of the most feared punishments in La Sabaneta was execution by la piscina, a brutal method where prisoners were drowned or beaten to death in a flooded section of the prison. Others were burned alive, hacked to pieces, or forced to fight to the death for the amusement of gang leaders. The absolute lack of government oversight meant that these atrocities happened every single day, without any consequences for those responsible. Even though the Venezuelan government was aware of the corruption, little was done to stop it. Many officials profited from the bribes and illegal activities inside the prison, while others simply feared retaliation from the powerful gangs. Attempts to reform the system were met with resistance from both the criminal organizations and corrupt officers, ensuring that La Sabaneta remained a lawless and deadly environment. With gangs in control and authorities looking the other way, La Sabaneta was not a prison. It was a criminal empire where violence and corruption ruled over everything. Prisoners were not just serving sentences. They were trapped in a nightmare of extortion, fear, and brutal oppression, where only the strongest or richest could hope to survive. After decades of brutality, corruption, and unimaginable suffering, La Sabaneta Prison was finally shut down in 2013. The closure was presented by the Venezuelan government as a move to reform the country's broken prison system, but the reality was far more complex. The decision to shut down La Sabaneta came after years of international criticism, shocking reports of violence, and countless massacres that had turned the prison into one of the most notorious hellholes in the world. However, for many former inmates and families of those who died inside its walls, the closure did not bring justice. It simply erased the evidence of decades of neglect and corruption. By the time of its closure, La Sabaneta was completely out of control. The prison had become more of a war zone than a correctional facility, with gangs running every aspect of life inside, and prisoners living in horrific, subhuman conditions. The Venezuelan government could no longer ignore the daily murders, disease outbreaks, and drug-fueled chaos that defined La Sabaneta. With international human rights organizations exposing the atrocities happening within its walls, shutting it down became a political necessity rather than a moral decision. One of the key events that accelerated the closure of La Sabaneta was a massacre in September 2013, in which at least 16 prisoners were killed and dozens more were seriously injured in a violent gang war. The killings were so brutal that even the Venezuelan authorities, who had long turned a blind eye to prison violence, could no longer ignore the scale of the bloodshed. This event triggered a nationwide crackdown on the country's most dangerous prisons, with La Sabaneta being one of the first to be permanently shut down. However, the closure was not a smooth process. With more than 3,700 prisoners crammed into a facility built for just 700, relocating them to other prisons was a logistical nightmare. Many inmates were transferred to similarly overcrowded and violent prisons, while others simply vanished from the system, either escaping, being released through corruption, or being killed during the transfer process. The Venezuelan government claimed it was moving prisoners to more secure and rehabilitative facilities, but many critics argued that the closure of La Sabaneta was merely a way to cover up years of human rights abuses rather than genuinely improve conditions for inmates. The shutdown of La Sabaneta also raised questions about what would happen to the gangs that had ruled it for years. With the prison being dismantled, many of the most powerful PRANs, gang leaders, were either transferred to other prisons, where they continued their reign of terror, or released due to corrupt dealings with officials. This meant that, instead of solving the problem of gang violence, the closure of La Sabaneta simply spread the problem to other parts of Venezuela's prison system. Additionally, the government destroyed many of the records related to La Sabaneta, making it difficult for investigators to fully uncover the true scale of the killings, corruption, and human rights violations that had taken place inside. Many families of prisoners who had died there never received any answers about what had happened to their loved ones. The official death toll of La Sabaneta remains unknown, with estimates ranging from thousands to tens of thousands over its decades of operation. The lack of proper documentation meant that many crimes went unpunished, and those responsible for the worst atrocities, both gang leaders and corrupt officials, escaped accountability. Despite its closure, La Sabaneta's legacy of horror lives on. Many of the prisoners who suffered there have shared their stories, exposing the barbaric treatment, extreme violence, and total collapse of law and order inside the prison. However, instead of leading to widespread prison reform, the shutdown of La Sabaneta was just another chapter in Venezuela's long history of failing its prisoners. The problems that led to its nightmarish conditions, corruption, overcrowding, gang control, and lack of government oversight, continue to plague Venezuela's prison system to this day. The closure of La Sabaneta prison may have ended its reign of terror, but the horrors that took place inside its walls can never be erased. For decades, it stood as a symbol of government neglect, corruption, and the failure of the justice system, where thousands of prisoners endured unimaginable suffering, violence, and death. The gangs that controlled it may have moved on, but the systemic issues that allowed La Sabaneta to exist in such a lawless state still persist in Venezuela's prisons today. For the families of those who perished inside, justice remains out of reach. The government may have shut down the prison, but it never took responsibility for the atrocities that occurred there. The deaths of countless inmates were swept under the rug, their suffering forgotten by a system that saw them as disposable. The voices of survivors and former inmates serve as a chilling reminder of what happens when a prison is left to rot under the rule of corruption and unchecked violence. La Sabaneta was more than just a prison. It was a human rights disaster, a place where the value of life was reduced to nothing, and where cruelty became the norm. Its story is a warning to the world about the dangers of allowing prison systems to collapse into chaos, and a reminder that behind every statistic and every number, there are real people who suffered, fought, and in many cases, never made it out alive.